One of the most distinguishable aircraft ever to fly, the Handley Page Victor, formed one of the three-pronged elements behind the famous V-bomber squadron, Britain's initial aircraft-based nuclear deterrent that was set to combat rising Soviet aggression in the early days of the Cold War. Sadly, amid the collapsing role of the V-bomber squadron in frontline nuclear service, as ballistic missiles and government mistakes rapidly rendered the fleet obsolete, the futuristic Victor would find a new role as an aerial tanker, continuing in service for 35 years under the auspices of the RAF. The Victor's origins date back to early 1947, when the Ministry of Supply issued Operational Requirement B-3546, which was for a bomber capable of carrying a 10,000-pound bomb load at a speed of 575 miles an hour, over a range of 3,800 miles, and at a ceiling of 50,000 feet, with this bomb load also including the carriage of nuclear weapons in an internal bomb bay. At this time, the Handley Page Company had already begun work on the design of such an aircraft as early as February 1946, and had designated the project the HP-80, though once Requirement B-3546 had been issued, the firm's design was well advanced, and thus was submitted in May 1947, with one of its most unique and innovatory features being the use of a crescent wing. In November 1947, the Ministry awarded a contract to Handley Page for a prototype of its HP-80, to be powered by 4 Metrovic F9 turbojets, and in 1948, this engine project was taken over by the Armstrong-Siddeley Company, who renamed it to the Sapphire, with the power plant intended for the HP-80 being designated the Sapphire 100 and delivered 8,000 pounds of thrust. The original HP-80 design was considerably modified over the following 4 years, and in 1952 was well on its way to completion at the Handley Page Works at Radlett in Hertfordshire, with prototype Whiskey Bravo 771 being moved from Radlett to MOD Boscombe Down in Wiltshire prior to full completion, as the Ministry of Supply noted that the runway at Radlett was not long enough to guarantee the safety of the aircraft's maiden flight. Intentions were for Whiskey Bravo 771 to be flown to the SBAC Farnborough show in September 1952, but several setbacks delayed the flight, and, in the event, it would not be possible for the aircraft to make an appearance, while in December 1952, the HP-80 was named the Victor, and maiden flight finally took place on Christmas Eve of that year. In February 1953, Whiskey Bravo 771 returned to Handley Page's airfield at Radlett following the completion of runway extensions, with the Victor making its public debut at RAF Odiham in Hampshire as part of the Queen's Coronation Review of the RAF on July 15, 1953, with the initial flight testing of the first prototype proceeding with no major mishaps, and continued throughout the winter of 1953 and into 1954. These tests included high-altitude speed trials, though the aircraft was grounded from February to June 1954 for routine maintenance and system checks, after having completed around 60 hours flying time, while in June 1954, Whiskey Bravo 771 was scheduled to undertake several low-level calibration trials, which required passes over a measured distance at a variety of speeds. To alleviate as far as possible the inconvenience to local residents, it was decided to undertake these trials at the airfield of the College of Aeronautics at Cranfield in Bedfordshire, which was surrounded by sparsely populated countryside, with the Victor flying from Radlett, descending to low altitude over Cranfield, performing the test and then returning to base. On June 14th, the aircraft took off as planned under the command of Squadron Leader Ronald Taffy Eccleston, who was accompanied by 3 flight test observers, but tragically, during one of the low-level passes, the tailplane broke away from the aircraft, and it crashed into the ground and caught fire, killing all 4 on board. There was a considerable pause before the flight testing could be resumed, as the second prototype, Whiskey Bravo 775, was still under construction and had to be modified after the cause of the crash of Whiskey Bravo 771 had been determined, with it being deemed to be a failure of the 3 bolts that fixed the tailplane to the fin, thus seeing the tail unit of Whiskey Bravo 775 duly altered, with 4 bolts being used to secure the tailplane, and the height of the fin was reduced. This aircraft eventually took to the air on September 11, 1954, and subsequently appeared at the Farnborough Air Show, while weapons trials took place at Boscombe Down, followed by live drops over the range at Orford Ness on the Suffolk coast, all while the first production aircraft, comprising an order for 25 B-1s as ordered in August 1952, were nearing completion at Radlett. The production Victor B-1 was noticeably different from the prototype, employing 4 of the more powerful Sapphire 200 engines, while the fuselage was lengthened by 42 inches, which rectified a centre of gravity problem and provided space to install equipment, including the escape dinghy, while the height of the fin was reduced in accordance with the modifications made to the second prototype. The only other visible differences between the prototypes and the B-1 production aircraft were the removal of the dorsal extension of the fin and the installation of vortex generators on the wing, with the first production Victor B-1, X-Ray Alpha 917, taking to the air on February 1, 1956, followed by X-Ray Alpha 920 on May 5 of the same year. By March 1957, 10 aircraft had flown, of which 6 were engaged on trials with Handley Page, the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment, and the Royal Aircraft Establishment, with these units being X-Ray Alpha 917, 918, 919, 920, 921 and 922. Victor X-Ray Alpha 917 would prove to be remarkable for the fact that it inadvertently broke the sound barrier in a shallow dive on June 1, 1957, while conducting stability tests at altitude, with the test pilot, Johnny Allam, and the crew only becoming aware of this when Mach 1.1 registered on the airspeed indicator in the cockpit, a testament to the aircraft's smoothness and stability in flight. The first unit to receive the Victor B-1 was the radar reconnaissance flight at RAF Whiten in Cambridgeshire, with aircraft X-Ray Alpha 923, 924 and 925 first flying in late 1956, and were initially used by Handley Page at Radlett for trials, being fitted with H2S Mark 9 yellow satin side-scan radars, and were turned over to the RRF in March and April 1958. The RRF was a unit specifically created in 1951 to undertake clandestine radar reconnaissance to assist a bomber force in identification of targets in the event of war, with this unit sharing RAF Whiten with 543 Squadron, flying Vickers Valiant B PR-1s in strategic reconnaissance role, and 5-1 Squadron flying photo reconnaissance English Electric Canberra PR-7s and PR-9s. In November 1957, the 232 Operational Conversion Unit at RAF Gaydon in Warwickshire received its first Victor B-1 X-Ray Alpha 931, while in April 1958, the first Victor students at Gaydon qualified and joined the first operational unit, 10 Squadron, at RAF Cottesmore in Rutland, which was reformed on April 15th. During its evolution, considerable care had been taken in designing the Victor's flight deck, with one of the earliest criticisms of the cockpit layout of the prototypes being its unsatisfactory nature, including access to instruments and the comfort of the seating. The standard squadron crew of 6, comprising the pilot, co-pilot, navigator-plotter, navigator-radar, air electronics officer and crew chief were all accommodated on the same level and would be in close contact with each other, while aside from the 2 pilots, the other crew members all faced rearwards. By August 1958, 10 Squadron was up to strength with 8 aircraft, while on September 1st, the second Victor B-1 Squadron, number 15, was formed at RAF Cottesmore and received its first Victor on the 17th of that month, followed in January 1959 by 57 Squadron being reformed at RAF Honington, and in September 1960 was joined on the Suffolk base by 55 Squadron. In 1961, several B-1 aircraft in the process of being built at Handley Page were upgraded, with the most significant of these upgrades being to the electronic countermeasures suite, while other modifications included the provision of a flight refuelling probe and fixed droop leading edges to improve low-speed handling and performance, these aircraft being designated B-1As. In addition to the upgrades carried out on factory Victor B-1s, some aircraft were also recalled from the squadrons to be modified to B-1A standard, while at the same time, the first Victor B-2s were nearing completion at Radlett, with a total of 57 of this variant having been ordered. The most significant development for the B-2 was the change of engine to the Rolls-Royce Conway RCO-11 engine, delivering 17,250 pounds thrust. The installation of this engine requiring considerable modification to the wing roots and the engine nacelles, but enabled the B-2 to attain greater altitude and therefore endow greater survivability against surface-to-air missiles, while also providing more range. Other developments for the B-2 included the provision of 2 ram air turbo alternators in the rear fuselage just forward of the tailplane to provide electrical power in emergency situations, with the intake from the ram air turbo alternators extending when engine RPM fell below minimum. The B-2 also saw the return of the dorsal extension to the fin, seen initially on the Victor B-1 prototypes, while another addition to the B-2 was the installation of an auxiliary power unit installed in the starboard wing root, this being a French-designed turbomeca Artust, built under license by Blackburn and later Bristol Siddeley, which enabled the Victor B-2 to be started independently of ground services. The first flight of the B-2 took place on February 20th, 1959, when X-Ray Hotel 668 took off from Radlett with John Allam at the controls, though while conducting trials on August 20th, 1959, the aircraft crashed into the Irish Sea with the loss of all hands, and after a lengthy recovery, the wreckage was taken to Farnborough, with the cause of the disaster being found to be the loss of the pitot tube, which gave rise to faulty speed and altitude readings, causing the aircraft to dive into the sea. Just prior to the crash of X-Ray Hotel 668, aircraft X-Ray Hotel 669 had taken off on its first flight, and during the next 7 months, 669, together with 670, 671 and 672, made their maiden flights, and were engaged on tests and trials for Handley Page, the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment, and the Royal Aircraft Establishment. However, in July 1960, the order of 57 Victor B-2s was reduced to 32, with the principal reason for this being the cancellation in the United States of the GAM-87 Skybolt air-launched ballistic missile, though the development of the Blue Steel nuclear standoff missile for the V-Force was proceeding, and B-2 aircraft off the production line continued on trials programs, including Blue Steel. It was not until November 1, 1961, that the first B-2 was delivered to Sea Flight of 232 OCU, based at RAF Cottesmore, although the OCU itself was still at RAF Gaydon, and was thus designated the Victor Trials Unit, and in April 1962 became the Victor Training Flight, while the first Victor B-2 operational squadron was to be at RAF Wittering, and on February 1, 1962, 139 Jamaica Squadron was reformed at the Cambridgeshire base and received its first aircraft, where it was joined in April 1962 by newly reformed 100 Squadron. A programme of updates were initiated for the B-2 in 1962, which was prompted by several factors, not least the planned deployment of the Blue Steel to the squadrons at Wittering, with the retrofit upgrades involving an engine change to the Rolls-Royce Conways, which would give the Victor a considerable increase in performance, delivering £20,000 thrust. Other modifications included a further upgrade to the ECM suite, fixed droop leading edges as on the B-1A, and the fitting of fairings on the wings to contain the ECM chaff, with these fairings being known as Cushman carrots, after their designer, Dr. Dietrich Cushman, who was working in the aerodynamics department at the RAE in Farnborough, while Victor B-2s modified under the retrofit program were designated B-2R. The Victor was designed from the outset as a bomber, more specifically one capable of carrying and delivering a nuclear bomb to a target in the Soviet Union, with the first of these weapons to be delivered to the RAF in limited quantities being the British-designed Blue Danube. The first nuclear device carried by the Victor B-1 was the US-produced Mark V, followed by the UK-designed Yellow Sun Mark I and II hydrogen bombs, both of which were used by the Victor B-2 and Vulcan B-2, while the Redbeard tactical nuclear weapon was also in limited use in the V-Force. The Red Snow warhead used in Yellow Sun was also used in the Blue Steel standoff missile, with developments of Blue Steel having begun as early as 1954, when the Air Staff issued Operational Requirement 1132 for a high-speed, rocket-powered nuclear missile, which was to be capable of being released from an aircraft while out of the range of Soviet SAM defences, and under its own power would fly to the target, where the engine would stop and the device would freefall and detonate. The manufacturer chosen to develop and build these weapons was Avro, based at Woodford in Greater Manchester, with Victors directly involved in the trials for the Blue Steel being X-Ray Hotel 674 and 675, and X-Ray Lima 161 and 162, with X-Ray Hotel 674 and 675 being involved from July 1960 to April 1964 under the auspices of Handley Page, the Airplane and Armament Experimental Establishment, Avro and RAF Wittering. Victor X-Ray Lima 161 was also based at RAAF Edinburgh Field in South Australia with No. 4 Joint Services Trials Unit of the RAF, and was involved in trials at Woomera from May 1962 through to September 1964, though on August 17, 1962, this aircraft entered an uncontrolled spin at high altitude while carrying a Blue Steel, and thus using the brake chute to exit the spin. The aircraft then jettisoned the weapon and returned to land at Edinburgh Field, but continued to fly trials including both high and low altitude launches. Following the shoot-down incident of Gary Power's Lockheed U-2 spy plane by a Soviet SAM on May 1, 1960, the shockwaves were felt throughout NATO countries and their allies, as the U-2 had been flying at an altitude in excess of 70,000 feet, and thought to be immune to any form of interception. Soviet fighters had tried to reach Powers and failed, but an S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile had succeeded, the lesson of this event being that if a U-2 could be shot down at 70,000 feet, then manned bombers flying at considerably lower altitudes were extremely vulnerable, and the decision was taken for the V-bombers to become a low-level attack force. This caused some concern that the stresses inflicted on the airframes of the Valiants, Vulcans and Victors would render the low-level role impossible, but for the Vulcans and the Victors, these fears initially proved groundless, and training for the new role started in 1963, with the attack profile for these aircraft being high-low-high. This entailed these units taking off from their UK bases and climbing to 40,000 feet, then dropping to as low as 1,000 feet or below before entering enemy airspace, after which they would deliver their payload at target before exiting the area at low level until clear, then climbing away, while the low-altitude role also prompted the application of grey-green camouflage to the upper surfaces of the V-bombers. The premature retirement of the Valiant in January 1965 due to severe fatigue problems had considerable implications for the Victor in its development in RAF service, as the Victor B SR-2 was ideally equipped for service with 543 Squadron based at RAF Whiten, which had flown the Valiant in the strategic reconnaissance role. The B-2 aircraft designated for the conversion to SR model were taken from their squadrons and underwent a retrofit program to B-2R specification, while the Bombay was modified to carry a cradle equipped with a range of cameras and additional fuel tanks, which also included the provision for the carriage of photo-flash canisters for night photography. The first SR-2 to take to the air was X-Ray Lima 165, which made its debut flight in February 1965, and was engaged in several trials, but did not join 543 Squadron until January 1967, with this unit being part of the Central Reconnaissance Establishment, together with 58 Squadron with its Canberra PR-7s, and 51 Squadron with Comet 2Rs, Canberra B2s and B6s, with the CRE being headquartered at RAF Brampton in Cambridgeshire, close to RAF Whiten, where the flying units were based. Radar and photo reconnaissance, including survey flying, were the principal roles of the 8 Victors of 543 Squadron, and their performance was, overall, much better than the Valiants they replaced, with their range being as much as 40% greater, enabling the amount of reconnaissance to be carried out on a single sortie to be dramatically increased, with it being noted that 5 Victors could satisfactorily radar map the entire Atlantic in 7 hours. Their maritime role included observing and photographing Soviet shipping, and Victors often carried out clandestine radar sorties along the borders of the Warsaw Pact countries, with this squadron eventually being disbanded on May 24, 1974. At the same time, during the 1960s, it became apparent that the RAF would soon be needing a new tanker aircraft, and in November 1962, the Air Council decided to replace the Valiant with the Victor, with work beginning on the conversion of B-1 aircraft to 3-point tankers, and would be redesignated to K-1 for its new role. However, following the unexpected early retirement of the Valiant, the need to have a replacement in service as quickly as possible led to the conversion of some B-1As to be converted to 2-point tankers, known as BK-1As, with these aircraft retaining a weapons capability, and had 2 hose and drogue refuelling points on the wings. The first of these aircraft flew on May 7, 1965, and on May 25th, the Victor tanker training flight was formed at RAF Gaydon, and 55 Squadron moved to RAF Marham to become the first Victor Air Refuelling Squadron, while in December of that year, 57 Squadron moved from RAF Honington to Marham to become the 2nd Air Refuelling Squadron. Meanwhile, aircraft from both 10 and 15 Squadrons, which had been disbanded in 1964, arrived at Radlett for conversion, which involved B-1s becoming K-1s, and B-1As being altered to K-1As, with the first K-1 being delivered to 57 Squadron at Marham in February 1966, while in September, 214 Squadron, which had flown the Valiant tankers from the Norfolk base, was reformed at Marham with Victor K-1 tankers, alongside the tanker training flight, air refuelling school, and the Victor flight simulator. With the retirement of the Victor B-2 bombers in 1968, and the disbanding of 100 and 139 Squadrons, more aircraft became available for the tanker fleet, primarily to replace the K-1, K-1A, and BK-1A tankers then in squadron service, and in 1970, following the demise of Handley Page, the contract to convert B-2 aircraft to tankers was awarded to Hawker Siddeley Aviation. The Victor B-2 and B-SR-2 aircraft languishing at Radlett, awaiting conversion, were transferred to Hawker Siddeley's airfield at Woodford to undergo the conversion to Victor K-2s, with HSA's conversion being designed to increase the life of the Victors, and thus necessitated taking the aircraft apart and refurbishing and upgrading component pieces, with all bomber and Blue Streak components being removed. It was not until October 1972 that the first Victor K-2 was flown from Woodford, and in May 1974, the first example was delivered to 232 OCU at RAF Marham, while in June 1975, 55 Squadron relinquished its K-1 and K-1A tankers, and these were passed on to 57 and 214 Squadrons, while in June the following year, 57 Squadron converted to the K-2, and in January 1977, 214, which was still flying the K-1, was disbanded. In March 1986, the 3 remaining Victor units, 232 OCU, 55 and 57 Squadrons, were resident at RAF Marham, though in April of that year, 232 OCU was disbanded, and in June, 57 Squadron was also disbanded, leaving No. 55 Squadron as the only Victor unit in the RAF. However, even though the Victor was designed as a nuclear and conventional bomber, these machines only ever went to war in the tanker role, starting in 1982, when on April 2nd of that year, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, a British territory in the South Atlantic to which it had long laid claim. The British response was to send a task force to the area to wrest control of the islands back from the invaders, with this task force including a considerable RAF element, a part of which were the Victor tankers of RAF Marham. With Air Force operations taking place so far from home, aerial refuelling was of the utmost importance, and the Victor K-2s of 55 and 57 squadrons rose to the occasion, and throughout the duration of the conflict, the Victors rotated from Marham to Wideawake Airfield on Ascension Island in the Atlantic Ocean. The first 5 aircraft arrived on Wideawake on April 18, 1982, and were joined by 4 more Victors the following day, while during the duration of the conflict, further Victors were deployed, although they were not exclusively involved in aerial refuelling missions, with some Victors having the H-2S radar reinstalled so that they could conduct maritime radar reconnaissance. On April 20th, Victor X-Ray Lima 192 undertook the first MRR mission when it flew to South Georgia in a sortie lasting 14 hours and 45 minutes, supported by other Victor tankers, while from the Atlantic base, the tankers also refueled Nimrods, C-130s, Harriers and Sea Harrier deployments, and the Vulcan Black Buck missions, the latter raids being owed significantly to the availability of the Victors. There were, in all, 7 Black Buck missions, of which not all were successful, with 2 having to be aborted, while perhaps the most memorable of the Black Buck operations was the first, with Vulcan X-Ray Mike 607 being supported by 13 Victors throughout the course of the mission on April 30th, 1982, with the Vulcan's raid, which involved the dropping of 20 general-purpose bombs that straddled the runway at Port Stanley's airport, putting this facility out of action to Argentinian Air Force jet fighters. The Victors were to support a further 4 Black Bucks between May 3rd and June 12th, of which 2 were bombing raids aimed at Port Stanley Airfield, and 2 were anti-radar missions, with the Vulcans being armed with Shrike AGM-45 anti-radiation missiles, while a detachment of Victors remained at Wideawake to support the C-130 air bridge from Ascension to the Falklands following the end of hostilities on June 14, 1982. 8 years later, on August 2, 1990, Iraqi armed forces launched an invasion of Kuwait, and the UK dispatched a response team to that region, with 55 Squadron, the only remaining Victor K-2 unit that was supported by VC-10 and TriStar tankers, partaking in Operation Granby, the name of the British operation to eject Saddam Hussein's forces from Kuwait. Prior to their deployment to the area in December, the Victors had refueled RAF fast jets flying to the Gulf region, and during the conflict, Victors were based at Muharraq in Bahrain and RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus, with their work not solely extending to RAF types, but also aircraft of the other coalition forces that used the Probe and Drogue air-to-air refuelling system. Following the cessation of overt hostilities on February 28, 1991, Victors remained on detachment in the area at Akrotiri and Muharraq until September 1993 as part of Operation Southern Watch, followed in October of the same year by 55 Squadron being disbanded, and the Handley Page Victor ending its service with the RAF after 35 years. In summary, the Handley Page Victor would prove itself to be one of the most iconic of Britain's V bombers, as supported by its futuristic design and exceptional performance, that would have made it a useful ally in any prospective nuclear conflict between the capitalist West and communist East had it occurred. However, as the V-bombers lost their role, the Victors would find new life serving as tankers, and ultimately come to provide invaluable assistance across multiple theatres of combat, their auspicious careers being largely overshadowed by the more recognisable Vulcans, but their duties being no less vital to the success of frontline task forces during the final years of Britain's influence on the global stage.